But thank you all so much for coming and joining us today. Welcome to the 6th and final lecture in the MRI Anniversary Lecture Series. It's been a wonderful year of celebrating 20 years since the MRI Coordination Office here in Bern, Switzerland was founded in 2001. My name is Gabrielle Vance. I'm a scientific project officer here at the MRI in Bern, but I'm from Alaska originally, as you can see from my background. And I'm really happy and excited to introduce my colleague, Ana Ochoa-Sánchez, who will be sharing about her research today. Just to mention again, we are recording the meeting, so please keep that in mind. We'll have a lecture presentation from Ana, followed by an interactive Q&A. If you have a question at any point during the entire talk, please feel free to write it in the chat. And then during the Q&A, you can raise your hand, ask to be unmuted, turn on your video, whatever you feel comfortable with in terms of the recording. Okay, so thanks again for joining us, and yeah, happy 20 years. Go ahead, Ana, thanks.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here with me. I'm Ana. I work at the University of Azuay, and I'm here to present you about some of the findings that we have in a very interesting study. So I will share with you my screen. So I think it's fine there, right? You can see it.
Looks great.
Okay. So thank you for being here. Thank you also to the MRI for inviting me. I want to share with you a topic that we have investigated here for quite some time now. In fact, we started this study in September 2019 when I was selected to be part of the mentoring and training program in the IPCC Processes. Then I traveled to Switzerland. At that time, I went to the University of Zurich. I met there Professor Christian Hewell. He introduced me later to Fabian Drenkan, to Dahiston, and with a couple of colleagues here in Cuenca, Daniel Mendoza and Ronald Wallan, we started this interesting project. I also have to mention that Professor Christian Hewell has developed this a similar studies of detection and attribution in other mountain regions of the world, and that you will be able to see the main results of these studies in the next IPCC AR6 report, the report from the working group 2, specifically the cross chapter in mountains. So we'll start briefly on the importance of this topic, why we did it, and what is our main objective. I will also touch some parts of the methodology, because I think we have some interesting things here going on. It is the first time that we combine and that we mix the attribution assessment with, we mix two methods. Then we will talk about the main results of this study and some conclusions and further work that we believe we have to do. So first, we know that the main objective, the ultimate objective of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is that we need to stabilize the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that will prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. But how do we know what is dangerous? So in order to know if a human interference is dangerous, we need to monitor. We need to monitor the advance of the anthropogenic interference that we are having in our natural and human systems. So the main objective of this work is to do a detection and attribution assessments, because these allow us to know about the anthropogenic influence in the climate of climate change, and to advance to the United Nations main objective. So we know that mountain regions are among the most sensitive to climate change due to strong climate feedbacks that we have some of the most visible signs of climate change are found in mountains. For example, glacier retreat. Mountains are the world's water towers, and they provide several other ecosystem services, especially the Andean region. For example, it provides ecosystem services for more than 80 million people. That represents 45% of the people that lives in the countries that are crossed by the Andes. So in the Andes, we have impacts of anthropogenic climate change that have yet to be assessed in almost all natural and human systems. We have particular challenges also in this region, such as the lack of research, infrastructure, lack of funding, lack of understanding of processes that are going on, especially the complex social and environmental processes that are going on in the systems. So it is the first time that a detection and attribution assessment is conducted in this region. And with the amount of evidence that you will see that we have gathered, it is the first time that we can see the connections of climate change impacts in the physical, the biological, the human systems. So how we conducted this research? First, we did a systematic review. We tried to gather all the documents that record and observe change in the system and observe change in natural or human system. And then we found around 93 impacts in 12 systems. I will later on and tell you how we categorized these systems. Then we determined climate, non-climate drivers based on all the literature available. Sometimes, for example, the same article documented a change in the system, and the same article talks about climate trends. For example, if the driver of this change is precipitation, they provide examples of how precipitation has been changing in magnitude and in distribution, for example. But we also investigated about non-climate drivers that were commonly discussed in the same articles that we found. So you can see in the picture all the study areas from all the articles and the studies that were included in the systematic review. We extracted information only for the Andean region that crosses Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. And then with all this gathered information, we did the detection and attribution assessments. The detection assessment consists in assessing the evidence, analyze, for example, the quality of the study, the consistency of results that we have, the length of the study period, the agreement among different studies, and based in all of this, we provide a confidence level from very low to very high. So we have a guide for that. This guide is usually used in the IPCC and is the Mastandrea et al. 2010 scale. And well, for example, a study that has a lot of data, that has a length study period that has, for example, 20 years, that has very rigorous methods, and that we have other studies that find the same in other study areas, then we will provide a high or very high confidence of detection. Attribution is then the assessment of anthropogenic influence in the detected impact. This means that at what level the humans are changing the climate through the greenhouse gas emissions, for example, that can cause increasing temperatures, that change precipitation magnitude and distribution, and the following impacts that this climate change causes. So here it's interesting that we could combine two methodologies. One is the expert assessment, in which all the authors will look for climate trends, and we consider the published literature for each impact and also in each study site. And then we provide a confidence level of attribution. But the other methodology, and a very important one, is the model-based assessment. In this methodology, we had Professor Tahiti Stone, that is the expert on this topic. So he takes some data sets of observations of temperature in precipitations. He sees the agreement between these data sets, and then he compares these observations with models that take into account the greenhouse gas emissions. So if you see that the observations are similar to the models that consider the influence, the anthropogenic influence, then you provide that, based on the similarity, you provide a level of confidence from no confidence to very low, low, medium, high, or very high. So here you already can see that for temperature, for example, we have high attribution to anthropogenic influence on rising temperatures. Some countries even you have very high, and some countries you have medium. But it's not the same for precipitation, because you don't have agreement among the data sets. Basically, it's because of that we have a lower attribution to anthropogenic influence in precipitations in most of the countries, and in some regions you have medium. So we mixed, I forgot to tell you here, that then at the end we mixed these two methods. Most of the time we paid a little bit more attention to the model-based assessment, since the model-based assessment has the capacity to actually consider the greenhouse gas emissions. But sometimes we had enough information of climate trends in a specific study site, and we could consider the expert assessment more. And to end with this part of the methodology, I really want to highlight here that we categorize the impact in the system in this way. So we have the cryosphere, for example. We found evidence, for example, of glacier retreat, especially in the tropics, of course. We categorize water, but water means increasing floods, it means droughts, decreasing water availability, decreased water quality. Then we have also impacts in ecosystems, terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Especially we found evidence for terrestrial ecosystem and just very few studies on aquatic ecosystems. Here we have decrease in species abundance and diversity. We have ecological succession and so on. We then called food security to the impacts in agriculture. For example, increasing pests, yield reduction, less agricultural productions, problems with livestock. Especially in this category, we found many perception studies that tell us about how communities have perceived the climate change impacts in the agriculture and in livestock. And then we have disasters. Disasters include evidence mainly about mountain hazards, for example, driven by rockfalls, ice detachments, snow avalanches, that in some cases have even triggered glacier lake outburst floods, the commonly named as GLOF. These disasters category also includes some infrastructure damage caused mainly by floods, for example, but we have fewer studies on that. And then we have energy that tell us about a decrease in hydropower potential, for example. This is a very important ecosystem services that mountains provide, but sadly we have understudied completely this system and we haven't found a lot of evidence on this energy system. We have also tourism in Andean communities. We have a system called migration, especially from of course, the Andean region, but to coastal places or big cities and nearby. We have found evidence on human health affectations and also in community changes and cultural values have been affected in the Andean region, where we have a high cultural diversity and we have mylinear rituals that have been also affected by climate change. So let's finally talk about our main findings. Here you have a couple of figures. In these figures, we have tried to summarize all our findings. In the left one, you can see that we have detection on impacts in each country for the Andean region, of course, and for each system. The detection confidence is marked with bullets. We also have the attributions assessment and confidence levels, and they are marked with bars. The most important things that I want to show you here is that first we have Peru, we have Chile with the most quantity of evidence, the most quantity of studies in so many categories of the human and natural systems. And many of them have high detection and attribution confidence levels. But on the other hand, we have, for example, Venezuela, where we didn't find many studies, almost none. We also have large evidence on some systems, like for example, for cryosphere. Mainly we talked here about glacier retreat, as I said. And we have also a lot of evidence for the systems that we have called water. So in almost all countries, you can see impacts in cryosphere, impacts in water, and also impacts in terrestrial ecosystems. But when we check about the human systems, there is less evidence of the impacts, especially for Colombia, for Ecuador, for Argentina. We have very few studies about human systems. So in the right side, in this figure, we have an average of the detection and attribution assessment for all the Andean region. We have a rather high confidence level in both detection and attribution. From the studies that we have found, a lot of them have robust evidence of changes in most of the systems. So many impacts are related to global warming, to rising temperatures, and therefore we have high or medium and high attribution confidences. In fact, the only system that you can see here that has medium, for example, is water. And that is because precipitation is the main driver. And as you can recall from a previous slide, I was telling you that records, observations on precipitation, then they don't match, they don't agree. And also we have found that for the studies that we gathered here in water, we also find some inconsistency and we don't have a lot of agreement among studies. And that is why we have a medium detection and medium attribution for this system. This figure is probably more important because with all the evidence that we could gather for each country and for all the Andean region, we then knew we also had evidence to show interconnections among systems. And that is something that I mainly want to discuss, like this cascading change of impacts, meaning that here rising temperatures and changes in magnitude and distribution of precipitation that are attributed to anthropogenic influence, like mainly rising temperatures, of course, they have an impact on physical systems like cryosphere, like water. But then those impacts have again an impact in biological systems. So biological systems are being impacted directly by increasing temperatures, directly by changes in precipitation, but also they are impacted by the things that are going on in cryosphere and in water. And the things get worse for the human systems, right? Because the human systems get the direct impact from climate change, but also they get the following impacts from other systems. And some other thing that we have to notice in this chain is that each step along the chain, it brings additional driving factors that are sometimes climate drivers, but also non-climate drivers. And that creates a complex cause-effect system, and it makes it harder to be confident about climate change influence that has been detected amongst these other many factors that we have. So now I will try to take you through some of the paths of this cascade chain of impacts. For example, we can talk about the cryosphere. So the glacier area has been shrinking across the whole Andes, primarily due to anthropogenic warming, anthropogenic influence of rising temperatures. This has led to reduce stream flow, for example, but it has also intensified migration from headwaters to downstream areas. The melting of glaciers has also impacted mountain ecosystems through, for example, upward plant colonization. Human tradition involves a very near relationship of Andean communities with glaciers, and therefore the melting of glaciers is perceived by communities as a loss of connection with them. Also, mountain tourism in various locations has been affected by the lack of glaciers, the glacier melting. And another important connection is that glacier retreat and permafrost degradation have led to more frequent disasters, like the ones I mentioned before: rockfalls, ice detachments, snow avalanches, and GLOF. And talking about these disasters, the Andes is one of the most prone regions to disasters. Is frequently affected by floods, by landslides, by these glacier lake outburst floods. And these impacts are not only attributed to climate change alone, but to the high vulnerability and the high exposure that we have in the Andes, like, for example, steep slopes, land use changes. We have settlements in sites that are risky. And a major driver also of flooding is ENSO, the El Niño Southern Oscillation, that causes damages to health, to infrastructure, loss of lives, impacting agriculture, livestock, etc. Another part of this water system is droughts, and droughts have affected food security in the Andean communities. They have caused also migration. They have caused health issues, loss of hydropower potential, and the impacts in food security also are particularly high, and they have additional drivers, right? We also have additional drivers here, and for example, social, political, economical issues. Agriculture is especially a very special part of the Andean livelihood and culture. For example, crops and livestock are organized in the Andes across to mylineal rituals, mylineal knowledge and cultural rituals, and therefore the impact in this system has led to loss of identity, and it has increased also migration. At the end of this change, at the end of this cascading chain of impacts, we have human systems. And there you have like increase in health problems. For example, dengue and respiratory difficulties have increased due to droughts, due to directly changes in temperature, changes in precipitation. And we also have human migration. This has been enhanced by the already mentioned drivers that I told you. And last but not least, we should discuss also a bit about the community changes in the cultural values, where we see that glaciers are perceived in the Andean cosmovision as deities. They are living beings, they are sacred places, and there are some rituals with peasant communities that, for example, make offerings in exchange of rainfall. In exchange, so glacier melting and changes in precipitation mean a loss of cultural identity and loss of rituals. Ice harvesting, for example, and traditional ritual practices are now modified to avoid harming the glaciers more. There are also some conflicts among Peruvian peasants, for example, due to the decrease in water availability. But we also have here so many other drivers like marginalization of rural communities, like mining that also take water, reduce access to resources, social conflicts, and so on, that can also play an important role in shaping these Andean communities. So to finish, I will just tell the most important part that I want to highlight and that I want you to keep from this small lecture, and that is that we have found a strong evidence of climate change impacts in natural, in human systems, in physical, biological human systems. Temperature increase and the consequent impacts are highly attributed to anthropogenic influence. And also, I want to highlight that these physical, biological, and human systems that I have mentioned, they are connected. And for that, we need to increase the understanding of these interlinked systems, increase the understanding of these connections that we have among the systems. And we especially need more information in the last part of the chain, that is the human systems. We need to know more about them and about the drivers of change. So that's it. Thank you for listening, and I'm open to hear your questions.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think the scale of your review is certainly very impressive, and I guess makes sense given that the scale of the Andes is so huge. So again, if you have questions to ask, you have several options. You can type them in the chat. You can unmute yourself and ask, turn on your camera if you like. You can raise your hand if you need assistance with any of that. So whatever feels most comfortable to you. I did want to mention, as I said in the chat, the figures Anna showed us have not been published yet. So we will share the recording of this lecture, but not the slides for that reason. And please don't take any screenshots or anything like that. Already a question in the chat from Andres. Are you very interesting lecture, Anna? Are you preparing publications, or do we have to wait until the IPCC WK2 AR6 report comes out?
Yeah, well, actually, the thing that will come out in the IPCC AR6 is just the very last results, like a very small summary of the Andes and of other mountain regions. So it will be very interesting to see that and to compare with other regions. But yes, we have a final manuscript now, and we are probably submitting this month, this December. And I will make sure that all of you can see that.
Yeah, thank you. So stay tuned for more. Okay, Jonathan, you have your hand up. Let me see if I can unmute you. One moment.
I think I'm unmuted.
Go ahead.
Hi Anna, thanks for the chat, for the talk. It's really, really interesting. So I had a couple of questions. One of them was really quick, I think, which was the cascading impacts diagram you had. I noticed there wasn't an arrow going from the energy sort of impact to any of the human aspects at the bottom, and I was just wondering why that is, because I would have thought the energy would feed into one of those, maybe human health or something like that. I was just wondering why I decided not to link that into the human aspect.
Sure, thank you for your questions. First, I have to say that in the absence of any arrow, we are not saying that it doesn't exist. We are just saying that we haven't found evidence on that. So probably, and yes, I agree with you, that less hydropower potential has a direct impact on human systems, like having less energy. And even in countries like ours, we also have suffered from that. But we haven't found any literature evidence. So we haven't found a paper. In fact, the energy system is one of the systems where we found almost nothing. So we have a very nice paper and a very nice study in Chile, but that's it. They talk about decreasing hydropower potential attributed mainly to decrease in water availability offshore, for sure, but that's it. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it's more of a question mark. We don't know exactly what the impact is. Okay. Thanks. I just one other really quick one, which was, I know at the start of the talk you mentioned 80, I think it was 80 million people in the Andes potentially at sort of risk of these different impacts. Is there, I'm guessing there isn't any information on this, but is there any indication as to which of these different impacts are the most important in terms of how many people they actually affect?
Well, I don't know exactly the number, but the evidence that we have, and in this aspect, it might be more important to remember about the studies that I found from perception studies, right? Because the perception studies, they provide a view about the communities and how they have been affected, what they tell us about what is the most things that have affected them. And then we have a lot of studies telling us that they have seen the glacier melting. That is something that I was talking about in cultural values and these connections that they have with the glaciers, but also in the agricultural part. So we have many perception studies in the agricultural part, in the food security, because people in the Andean communities, they're mainly, the main thing that they do is they have agriculture, they have livestock, and all of that is being decreased. Yeah, like they have more pests, they have less agricultural production, and for that reason, their children, the young people, they don't want to do agriculture anymore. They have to migrate to other cities and find other things to do. So that I will say that it's the most important affectation.
Cool. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an important point and something I've noticed throughout the series and throughout the synthesis workshops and the synthesis research that the MRI promotes in general is that sometimes doing reviews, it's as important what you don't find as what you do. And sometimes it can help identify knowledge gaps or places where more study is needed. If something's missing, it's not necessarily that that's not a relationship, but just that there's a lack of information about it. There was another question in the chat from Ruben, wondering if you conducted any normalization of the information before the assessment due to the large heterogeneity between the countries, for example, spatial scale, amount of documents, etc. And Ruben, you can also feel free to unmute yourself. I'm assuming you're referring to this figure here, but yeah, any Anna?
What we did is that we have here levels of confidence. So we are not dealing with quantities. We are not leading with numbers here. We are providing a qualitative information and assessment about what we found. So we definitely extracted from all the papers information about climate trends, for example, but we didn't treat it as numbers. We treated everything with qualitative scales. So they can be, we can compare in that way. If we say that in Ecuador we found medium confidence, then we can average with a high confidence of Peru and things like that. So in that manner, we can compare because we are not dealing with real numbers, let's say.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I definitely have some, but I'd love to give the audience the first chance if anyone else has any. All right. Well, one thing I was personally wondering about is, especially thinking about engaging with a public audience or a lay audience, what do you say to people who might be confused by these cascading and sometimes apparently contradictory impacts? For example, looking at droughts and glacial lake outburst floods. Do you ever encounter confusion about how these seemingly so disparate impacts could be coming from the same sources?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that we have to take one impact by one and one system by one, and we have to really, for sure here I have shown you in general terms, and I have talked a lot about water, and water means so many things. But the moment that we are interested in an impact, we need to see at that impact, and even we need to see at that study site. And that is what we try to do. We try to take one study site, know about that study site, the climate drivers, the non-climate drivers, because it can be a different story even among different sites. So I will say that we really have to focus on each of the things that are going on over there, because otherwise it's yeah, for sure it's very confusing. And also we have had some studies in which the results don't agree, and it's probably because we are not looking at all the drivers. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. The other question from my side for the moment is, you mentioned ice harvesting in traditional ritual practices, and I thought that sounded really interesting. And I was wondering if it's okay, could you elaborate a bit on what those might be? Perhaps it's protected cultural information, but if it's okay to share more about it, that would certainly be very
yes, I have a study on that, but also an anecdote, because here in the northern part of the Andes region in Ecuador, we had the last people that used to do ice harvesting. And that is because previously they don't have refrigerators. So they used to go up to the mountains, take the ice covered with grasslands, go back and sell it to people. So that is something that you don't do anymore because you have refrigerators now. But that is like a ritual and a very close relationship that they have with the mountain, that it's also beautiful to watch, but it also provides them with water, with ice, with all of these things. And those things have been changing. Yeah, they don't want to harm the glacier anymore. Sometimes they think it's their own fault that the glacier is melting, and they don't want to harm it anymore.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from anyone? You can feel free to write in the chat, raise your hand, or just go ahead and unmute yourself. Oh, it looks like Ruben's coming back, so maybe we'll be able to fix the audio problem. One moment. You know, there are always connection challenges. Ruben, welcome back. Are you able to unmute now? We'll try one more time. Okay, well, Ruben, if you are able to unmute, I've just asked you, but it doesn't seem to be working. If it does work, please feel free to jump in at any point. Another question that is always, I think, really fun to ask is, what was the most surprising finding so far? Something really unexpected?
Well, for me, there were many things that got me thinking, because I usually work on water resources. Of course, I'm interested in climate change and how it affects water. but I had the opportunity to read all these papers about biological systems, which I'm definitely not an expert, but especially the human systems. It's something that I can recall that it was very interesting to know and to read these perception studies, because there is so much information that you can gather from people. Andean communities, they have so many rituals and so many ways of doing things that are very different to what we do. And they already come up with some adaptation strategies, for example, and we have so much to learn about that. I've seen that lately. I've read a couple of papers on what we can learn from them in terms of adaptation strategies. So I was not expecting that. And I was very pleased that I could read those studies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. All right, any other questions from anyone else? Okay. Yeah, Ruben, sorry we had the audio issue, but you were able to hear most of Anna's answer. So it sounded like, just to restate, Anna, you didn't really do a normalization as such because you weren't working with numbers. Okay.
Sure.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you, Anna, for closing out the 20th anniversary lecture series. This was really exciting and interesting and a wonderful way to wrap up the year. Maybe Anna and I can stay for just a moment more in case anyone else has any last minute questions. But otherwise, yeah, thanks so much. Have a wonderful day wherever you are. And yeah, stay healthy and stay safe, everybody. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the MRI also for inviting me and for having me here.
Thank you. Bye.